I'd like to thank my commentators for their comments. Can you hear me? Is it working? Not on? Oh, it's on. Okay. I'm not going to comment on Luis. I didn't receive his comments in advance, so, but I'll be happy if people want to raise points about it in discussion to talk about it. David Sosa, he raised a number of interesting points. I'll just try to take the ones that I thought were most salient. As for the preliminaries, David wonders about the difference between lottery proposition and skepticism, and do I have a hand, that kind of skepticism. And I think there is a difference, because for brain in a vat worries about whether you have a hand, there the issue is, do you have any reason whatsoever for thinking you have a hand, and any reason whatsoever for denying you're a brain in a vat? What's distinctive about the lottery cases is you have lots of reason to believe lottery propositions. You've got lots of reason to believe you're going to lose, that you won't have a heart attack, that your car is parked where you left it. But the issue is the amount of evidence you have, or is the reason you have, sufficient for you to know? And although I urged contextualism as solutions to both kinds of skepticism, I've come under pressure from many of you sitting in the audience to worry about whether contextualism can really satisfactorily handle brain in a vat sort of skepticism. But I think it does quite well for the kind of lottery problem. Okay, then there's this issue about what David calls malapropisms that the contextualist is committed to. So Jones said truly, quote, I know P, but Jones doesn't know P. Or Jones knows that P, and he doesn't know that P, which the contextualist is committed to if you switch standards mid-sentence. But I think that's no problem for the claim that these malapropisms are no problem for the claim that the term knows and its cognates are context sensitive, because I think you get the same sense of malapropism for other uncontroversially context sensitive terms like flat. So if I say about somebody who lives, suppose I live in an area where it's very flat. In the U.S., that would be Kansas, say. And somebody's from Colorado, where they call roads, where it's mountainous in western Colorado, they call roads flat that they wouldn't call in Kansas. And I'm a Kansan, I guess, in Kansas. And I might say about a Coloradoan, he truly said, quote, the road is flat, but it's not flat. Now, of course, I filled in the background, but you might have the same worry there. Or if I say the table is flat, but it's not flat, after I look under a microscope. Again, there's the same, I think there's the same oddness there. So this is just a feature of context sensitivity, and it's really the semantic blindness thesis. Now, I think David has, though, put his finger on a worry for contextualism. I should probably avoid colloquialisms. David has noticed a problem for contextualism, something that I worry about, which is this. I think this is what is behind David's comment. Competent speakers will, most of them, readily accept, after some philosophical reflection, say they're thinking about Unger flatness skepticism, they'll accept the resolution of that paradox by saying descriptions of knowledge are context sensitive. And I have lots of experience that shows that people do not readily accept this as a solution to the lottery problem about knowledge. So why should this be? I mean, a sort of a facile thing I could say is, well, there are degrees of semantic blindness. We're more semantically blind about knows than we are about flat. But that demands some sort of explanation. So what can you say? I mean, one thing that occurred to me that I argued once in a paper is that, well, knowledge is an evaluative term, and flat is not. And somehow it's harder to give up on our evaluative ascriptions, than it is the non-evaluative ones. And then Ram said something interesting to me that I think is very useful. if you think that evaluative ascriptions have a sort of endorsement component to them, so when you say somebody knows something, you're not only describing it, but you're endorsing it in some way, then it would be hard to give up on the sense of no conflict, because there is a kind of conflict. It's not a conflict in truth value, but a conflict in what you're endorsing. But, you know, it's a fair point David raises. I take the point, and it's a problem, and I'm still thinking about that. Okay. Now, a lot of what David raised hinges on what he claims is a distinction between whether I know I have a hand and whether the sentence, quote, I know I have a hand, meaning what it does, is true in my mouth. And he says contextualism addresses the latter, but not the former. Now, maybe I have a tin ear here, but I see those as the same question. I don't know what the difference is between saying, I know I have a hand, and the sentence, I know I have a hand, meaning what it does, is true in my mouth. Those seem to me to be the same issue. So I guess I just am missing what's going on there. Let's see. Another point that David raised is that the paradox about knowledge can arise in thought as well as in speech. And he takes that to put pressure on the claim that you can solve skeptical problems by a semantic thesis about language. But I see no reason why we shouldn't say that thoughts as well as sentences can be indexical. I mean, it's representations that are indexical, whether they're linguistic representations or mental representations. Indeed, many people think that mental representations are linguistic. So the fact that we can think through the paradox as well as talk through it, I think is no problem for the view that contextualism can solve it. Yeah, you can think through the flatness paradox just as well. And surely that doesn't make us any less hesitant to say you can solve that paradox by saying flat is an indexical. David also said that flat is not like no in another way, that we're never tempted to think of one and the same object, that it's, we find it very easy to think about one and the same object, that it's flat and not flat at the same time. And I agree that's right if you fill in the context, as I did with Colorado and Kansas. But again, going back to the Unger case, it's the phenomenology of our intuitions when we first get in the grip of that kind of paradox about whether anything is flat is that when we think or say, oh my God, nothing is flat, physics has shown us that what we thought were flat surfaces are not, we take those thoughts or sentences, utterances, to conflict with our earlier flatness descriptions. You think there's a sense of enlightenment, you know. Oh my God, nothing's flat. I was wrong before when I said it's flat. Well, it's not easy to say, well, it's flat and it's not flat. The point remains, David's insight, that we more readily accept the contextualist resolution for flatness than we do for no's. Okay, the last thing, let me say something about David's own resolution to the skeptical paradox that he admittedly sort of gestures at. There, the point is to say, if I understood it correctly, that we don't have, there's no semantic blindness, but rather there's a kind of factual blindness. We just don't know what the standards should be for knowledge. Now, sort of my first reaction to that is to say, well, that's not a competing resolution of the paradox. That's just a restatement of the paradox, right? I mean, the paradox just is, on the one hand, I want to say I know that I'll never get rich, but on the other hand, I don't know I'll lose the lottery. So which one of those is right? They can't both be right. Well, where do you know, what's the right thing to say here? And what David says is, well, we just don't know. We're blind to that. Okay, right, it's a paradox. So I think it's kind of a restatement of the paradox rather than a resolution of it. But maybe this is what David is saying. David is saying, you know, here's where the epistemicism analogy comes in. And that's something like, it's hopeless. We're incapable of knowing where to draw the line. And that's just a kind of factual blindness we're stuck with. So we can't ever solve the paradox. And I guess that's more of a resolution in the sense that if it's true, it's the last thing to say about it. So maybe that's what you mean. Okay. Now, Matthias, let me say a couple points about what he says about the criticisms of contextualism, and then I'll address his competing view, what he calls the multiple concepts view. The first point Matthias raised is that my response to the disquotation objection that Hawthorne and Stanley and Wayne Davis raised conflicts with what he calls CCP, and that's, there's that. Matthias, what page is that on?
That should be on page
Okay,
three.
Page 3. So that says, when an attributor A makes a knowledge description and skeptical alternatives or error possibilities are salient in A's context, then using the word know, A means know by high standards. And since I argued that in cases where the speaker is aware that is making a report on a knowledge description a speaker makes in a different context, that he can disquote the speaker's utterance and ascribe the correct belief to the speaker. So then the use of know in the reporter's mouth picks up on the standard that applied to the speaker's ascription. But it's not that I hold the view that, say, in the example I gave with Rich, that I remain in my high standards context and managed to use the word know relative that where it picks out a low standard relation. Rather, the view is that I can easily shift out of my high standards context into a low standards context. So there's no violation of the core contextualist principle there. The whole point is we can shift in and out of these contexts. If we're focusing on error possibilities, standards go up, but if something practical brings us down, so to speak, then we can say something truly. And it's no different than this. I mean, suppose we're, again, thinking about flatness, skepticism, nothing is flat, you know, so we're up there in the philosophical clouds. Then somebody comes up to me and says, quick, I need something flat to write on. And, you know, and I hand them something. Say, oh, well, this is flat. Precisely what happened there is I shifted out of my high standards context into the low standards context and said something true. So I don't think what I said about the disquotation objection violates anything about the core contextualist principle. Now, okay, so then there's contextualism plus. That's on page 4. Again, the same point. So contextualism plus, when an attributor A utters that S knows that T, what A means by the word know is fixed by the standards of knowledge in A's context, except when A reports a knowledge description made by another attributor B. In that case, what A means by the word know is fixed by the standards of not A's, but rather B's context. Again, that's not my view of what happens. Rather, my view is that A shifts to B's context. Now, here I'm individuating context by standards. I mean, you could do it other ways. I mean, there's a sort of a nicety about whether you want to say we can be in different contexts and have the same standard. You could individuate context that way and just talk about standards. Or you could individuate the context by standards and then shift to that standard. And that's, I think, those are, nothing hangs on that. Okay, Chisholm. Matthias wonders whether I sort of attribute a kind of incompetence to one of the principal figures of 20th century epistemology, because Chisholm wasn't bothered by error possibilities. He thought we know, even when he thought about brains in a vat, that didn't bother him. But then Matthias correctly notes that, according to my view, one can resist the upward pressure on standards when error possibilities are salient. Now, there's a whole issue about, of course, when you think about context, you have to think about a conversation, and you have to think about not only the speaker, but the listeners. And there's a whole worry, Keith DeRose has a paper on this, there's a whole worry about what happens when speaker intentions don't line up with listener expectations. And I myself think there's a lot, it may be in some cases there's no proposition expressed, but when Chisholm is at his computer, or did he use a computer? I don't know. He could successfully, truly write the sentence, you know, I know things, even when he was thinking about error possibilities. But again, that's no problem for the claim that ascriptions of knowledge are context sensitive. Some people are not moved by skeptical arguments. The same thing applies to Unger flatness arguments. Some people, you say, see, if you look under a microscope, this table really isn't flat. They go, oh, come on, you know. All the same, that doesn't incline me to say that ascriptions of knowledge are not, ascriptions of flatness are not context sensitive, because some people are affected that way. So it's a fact about natural language that certain terms are context sensitive, but some people, in their own use of the term, are less willing to accommodate what for other people would be shifts in standards. So it's just a general phenomenon, no particular problem for the claim that knowledge is context sensitive. Okay, now the multiple concepts theory. Now, Matthias says that, so the multiple concepts theory is that knows is ambiguous rather than indexical. And Matthias said there's less semantic baggage for this theory, but I don't see that. I mean, contextualism says the word knows is indexical. The multiple concepts theory says the word knows is ambiguous. Both views are semantic. And the same point about Matthias said, you know, that the multiple concepts theory does things in the old-fashioned way, whereas the contextualism is epistemology done in the new linguistic or semantic way. But again, it seems to me each is a semantic thesis about the word knows that's doing the thesis, that's doing the work, right? Which is better, the indexicality thesis, context sensitivity, or the ambiguity thesis? If you were writing a formal semantics for English, I think you could do it either way. I mean, formally, it wouldn't make any difference. Now, presumably, if you've got a case of a term that has an indefinite number of meanings, all of which are related in a certain way, I think it's much more natural to construe that as indexicality, as opposed to, you know, riverbank. The English word bank is ambiguous between financial bank, where you make deposits, and riverbank, that you stand on when you look down on the river. So you've got two cases completely unrelated. There it seems clear it should be ambiguity. But when you have, you know, knowledge is a three-place relation between a person, a proposition, and a standard, and then all that changes from context to context is the value of the standard place, and the rest remains the same. So you've got all these related meanings, and there's an indefinite number of them. Then it seems more natural to think, you know, in sort of Kaplan-esque terms, that what you've got, all these words have in common is a character. In Kaplan's sense, where a character is a function from context to content. But the character is not a constant function. So the word will have different contents, or its predicate will express a relation that's indexed to different standards in different contexts. That seems a more natural way to do it. Okay, now Matthias says that the multiple concepts view has advantages over the indexicality view. And I just don't see that. And it shouldn't happen, if I'm right, that these are sort of technical variations. And as I listened to Matthias, I thought each time I didn't go along with him. Now maybe some of you did, and I'd like to hear why, but it seems to me each view says essentially this. There's a sense in which what the skeptic says is true, and there's a sense in which what we say in our day-to-day lives is true. That's the core of either view. So, and I don't see how you can wring any advantage for one out of the other. Out of the other that you can't wring out of the other. Sorry. I went to bed earlier than most of you, but still, I'm lacking a little bit in sleep. I think you got the point. Okay, so that's all I'll say.